There is no efficient governing without efficient forecasting. Otherwise, you're bound to make horrendous mistakes if you don't have accurate forecast on which to base your policy making.
To govern is to foresee. Not to foresee is not to govern, but to run to one's ruin, once wrote the 19th century French politician Adolphe Thiers. Recent findings show we can drastically improve how we can predict the future thanks to the power of crowd forecasting. Hi, I'm Stephen Boucher, co-editor of the Handbook of Collective Intelligence for Democracy and Governance here in its luscious 861 grams, and founder of Democracy and Smarter Together. I'm delighted to be hearing today from Emile Servan-Schreiber, founder of Hypermind and professor at the School of Collective Intelligence, about the amazing achievements of crowd forecasting and how it can help us to predict uncertain complex events. In this episode, we explore how the wisdom of crowds can help policymakers predict the future better than even the best individual experts, how simple algorithmic tweaks can help elicit better predictions, and how super forecasters beat the CIA year after year.
Hello, my name is Emile Servan-Schreiber. I'm a professor at the School of Collective Intelligence of Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco, and also a founder of Hypermind, a company that creates online collective intelligence platforms for forecasting and also for ideation, prioritization to serve governments, NGOs, private companies around the world. So in 2019, which is a year before COVID arrived on the scene, we were contacted by the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health Center for Health Security, which are the folks in charge of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. And they wanted to create a crowd forecasting system to use collective intelligence to improve forecasting of disease outbreaks, infectious disease outbreaks, because it's a domain where there is huge amounts of uncertainty, very little reliable, timely data that is available, and very few models that you can actually use to measure the severity of outbreaks of various diseases. We made predictions about 19 diseases: Ebola, dengue, flu, all sorts of things, and then eventually COVID, right? There's plenty of bugs out there. A year after we had started the system with hundreds of experts recruited by Johns Hopkins, we were able to make predictions about the COVID outbreak as well. So the idea of crowd forecasting is to use collective intelligence to improve forecasting. So why would collective intelligence improve forecasting in the first place? Crowds can help you in two ways. The first way is that crowds, as we know from Wikipedia, are extremely efficient at gathering information far and wide, deep and wide. The second thing is that crowds can also help you make better guesses, because every individual guess is going to have a certain amount of error and noise in it. But when you combine the guesses of many different people, each with their own different types of errors, you're very likely to eliminate most of the error and only keep or aggregate or add up the knowledge that is contained in every individual guess. So you have a collective guess that is much better usually than even the best individual guess. The way that it differs from statistical forecasting is that statistical forecasting relies on huge amounts of data. Right? So if you want to have an AI model that makes predictions, you need to have huge amounts of data with which to train your AI model in the first place, machine learning, right? In many things that you are interested in forecasting, including infectious disease outbreaks, the data is not only noisy when you have data, but most of the time you don't really have data, or when you have data, it's not at the right time. By the time that you learn what's going on the ground in Congo so that you can process the data in your lab in Washington or in Brussels, basically the data is already outdated, right? So crowd forecasting can help you when the data is not really available or when the data is very sparse or very noisy, because it helps aggregate the wonderful processing power of individual expert brains who can manage noisy data much better than computers do. So who participated to the crowd forecasting? Well, one very large group, the majority of the group, was recruited by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. We were able to recruit hundreds of different experts, all sorts of folks with specialized medical knowledge from different angles around the problem of infectious disease. And then we also had another population recruited from Hypermind who were vetted expert forecasters. They were not expert in any particular domain, but they were proven champion forecasters in various domains: economics, politics, geopolitics, etc. But their ability to have a forecasting method, systematic forecasting method, enabled them to apply it to all kinds of topics that they're interested in, including topics in which they are not necessarily experts, like infectious disease. We had these two populations, so we had these domain experts in public health and medicine and infectious disease, and we had these experts in forecasting, which were not domain experts but champion forecasters. We asked 61 questions, some of them lasting several weeks, some of them lasting several months, and then we report the collective prediction on a daily basis for all these questions. And then once we know the result, we can score everyone, right? And then eventually we award prizes to the best forecasters. So everybody's in a competitive situation where they're trying to outperform everybody else and especially outperform the collective. So the type of question we were asking these people, we were trying to measure the severity of an outbreak. So let's say we learn about an outbreak of COVID in January 2020, and the question is then how many states around the world are going to report at least 1,000 cases of COVID-19 before the end of March. And so people would have to give probabilities for various levels of severities, less than 15, 15 to 30, 30 to 45, and more than 45. And then what the platform does is take all these individual assessments of probabilities and put it together into a sophisticated, optimized, weighted average that takes into account the expertise, the success that every individual had in making previous predictions, and the time of the prediction, like was the prediction made this morning rather than last week. Also the frequency of updates of predictions, all sorts of little things we can put together to assess whether this prediction is better than that prediction before we put it together into a weighted average. And then we report that weighted average, which is updated every day. So you can see how the collective prediction evolves over time. So what's interesting when we had everybody scored for all the predictions is we can look at the performance of the crowd compared to the performance of individuals, right? Independently of the population, let's take all of them together, what we could see is that some people were much better than others. But most people were clustering around a level of performance that was the same level of performance that somebody would have when they're answering the questions randomly. Just like a monkey would throw darts at the different answers, right? So a level of individual performance that was not very impressive at all. And the reason for that is because the task that we're asking them to forecast was very difficult. Forecasting, we have to remember, is hard work. You need to gather the information, you need to spend time. And even if you do that, it's still very hard because the data is very noisy. You don't really know what's going on the ground in Congo. By the time you know what's available to know, it's probably obsolete in terms of information. So the environment is super noisy. So it's very difficult to make very good predictions, even for the most experts in the population. But the amazing thing is that when you take the simple average of everybody's prediction, just a simple average, it beats 99% of all the individual predictors. So out of almost 600 people, we had only 6 individuals who were able to do better than the average of the entire crowd. And then when we add these little heuristics that I talked about earlier, timeliness of the forecast, track record of the individual forecasters on previous questions, and the frequency of updates of everyone, so people who update more frequently are probably better informed. Then we use that to compute a weighted average. The optimized collective forecast, we call it, beats everyone, even the best individual forecasting champion. We had two populations, right? We had domain experts, public health, infectious disease, and then we had champions in forecasting itself, right, in the method of forecasting. And we actually had mixed these two populations in the crowd making the forecast, and they were competing with each other. And what we observed is that the domain experts, the experts in infectious disease and public health, did not individually or collectively do better forecasts than the forecasting champions. So the general purpose citizen forecasters, if you like, were able to perform exactly as well as the domain experts in this very difficult forecasting exercise. But not only that, but when we put them together as a single crowd and look at the quality of the forecast of everybody together, then we find that it beats the forecast of the domain experts only. So what it means is that you can invite citizen forecasters who are interested in a particular topic and have some forecasting chops. So in the last decade, there was a lot of research on the ability of crowd to make geopolitical forecasts. Okay. This research was sponsored by the US intelligence agencies because they obviously have strategic interest in quality forecasting. They are aware that their professional forecasters inside the agencies are not perfect. And so they wonder whether crowds of citizen forecasters could help them out. So they financed these very large-scale, multi-year research projects on the ability of citizen forecasters by the tens of thousands to make complex geopolitical forecasts. And what they found is two things. So first thing is that the crowds of citizen forecasters are able, through these crowd forecasting techniques, to rival the collective prediction of the professionals inside the agencies. Okay, so that's already impressive, but it's the same result that we observed with the infectious disease project. And the second one is that there are some people in the crowd who are much better than others. And these people are much better than others, not only the first year of the competition, but also the second year of the competition and the third year of the competition. It's always the same people who beat the crowd. And those people, you might say, are what has been called super forecasters. We found that there is a particular population, small population, 2%, of the crowd who has this natural, instinctive ability to make excellent forecasts because they have the right method. So that was the great learning of the project, is you can learn to become a better forecaster by especially being open to contradictory opinions of other people around you. The people we observed who were the best at forecasting are also the people who are the most open to criticism, and they actually go and seek the criticism of other people because they think that being criticized is not a problem, and when they are criticized, they see it as an opportunity to learn something that they might have missed in order to make a better forecast. So how is this relevant for policymakers? Well, in March 2020, we already had like a year of data. And of course, then the topic of the day is COVID-19. And so the leader of the project, Tara Sell at the Center for Health Security in Johns Hopkins, is invited to Congress, the US Congress, to testify on methods to better forecast infectious disease like COVID-19.
Traditional disease surveillance is critical during infectious disease outbreaks. However, this information can be supported with tools to help support decision-making. One such tool is crowd forecasting.
One of the great lessons they take from this project is that not only is crowd forecasting very helpful in improving the quality of the forecast, so that most of the time the most likely outcome according to the crowd forecasting is also the outcome that actually is observed on the ground, but also it allows to measure the uncertainty around these outcomes.
Crowd forecasting consolidates the diverse opinions of many into hard probabilities for future outcomes. This is helpful in gauging the most likely outcome, but also for understanding the uncertainty about that outcome.
So for example, if you have a prediction that something is 90% likely to happen, then there's very little uncertainty. But if you have a prediction where the crowd stays around like 65% that something has a chance of happening, then obviously that's indicating a lot more uncertainty around the outcome. So both of these, having a better appreciation of what is likely and what isn't, and measuring the uncertainty around the likelihood, are both very useful for policymakers to decide what to do and how to proceed. Key takeaways for policymakers are 5. Okay? First of all, we have to remember that there is no efficient governing without efficient forecasting. Right? Governing is, first of all, forecasting efficiently. Otherwise, you're bound to make horrendous mistakes if you don't have accurate forecast on which to base your policy making. Secondly, what's great is that collective intelligence can improve forecasting by vast amounts, just like these 2 projects I mentioned, whether it's geopolitics or infectious disease, have proven that crowd forecasting really is pushing the limits of our ability to make forecasts. Thirdly, crowd forecasting is able to shed light on forecasting problems where the data available is noisy and sparse, which is something that is very complicated for artificial intelligence, right? Artificial intelligence is very good at making forecasts based on huge amounts of data, time series or whatever, but when you're dealing with problems where the data is very sparse and very noisy, then AI is nowhere to be found. It's totally inefficient for that. So crowd forecasting really starts where AI stops. Fourth, we find that skilled citizen forecasters who have proven their forecasting chops on various forecasting problems beforehand and have been vetted are able to efficiently augment crowds of domain experts who may not be as experienced in making forecasts. So when you mix these 2 kinds of expertise, domain expertise and expertise in forecasting itself, then you get this super powerful crowd of forecasters who are able to give you great collective forecasts. And finally, the good thing about crowd forecasting compared, let's say, to AI forecasting is that it's highly explainable. People are able to give you reasons for their forecast, and you're able to not only aggregate the probabilities into quantitative prediction that is very precise, but also to have the explanations, the backstory for the quantitative forecast, which is absolutely essential, because if you only have the quantitative forecast with no explanation, then it cannot be trusted. So crowd forecasting is essentially forecasting you can trust.
To find out more about how collective intelligence can make our democracy stronger, go to our website, Smarter Together. There you will find all the handbook's 30+ case studies and other resources, all for free.